You might know Flight Insight for its straightforward aviation lessons, specifically its ground schools, which have become a trusted resource for pilots at every stage. And today, we're talking to the face behind it all.
Most pilots have this moment where it just clicks and you're obsessed.
Dan George has become a steady presence for pilots navigating everything from their first ground lesson to advanced training.
Teaching is how you get mastery in a subject.
As a CFI, educator, and a creator, he's built a platform that's reshaping how pilots learn.
Think like Duolingo for air traffic control.
With clarity, consistency, and a deep respect for the craft of teaching.
Education is so important in aviation. Lives are at stake.
In this episode, we explore what makes great instruction stick,
pilots and students crave mastery,
how aviation education is evolving.
DPEs are now saying, okay, don't just ratchet off what the required equipment is. I'm going to ask you a real world scenario.
And why the best teachers never stop learning themselves.
Three, two, one.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for being here with us on Between Two Wings here in Austin.
Thank you.
Happy to have you.
Really excited to be here. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, the first question that I'd love to ask you is, can you tell me a little bit about your first flight or your first lesson for that matter, and kind of explain how you first started flying?
My first experience with flight, from a pilot's perspective, it wasn't my intro flight. I obviously had taken commercial flights for work, for travel before, but the first time I was able to really experience it was I did a flight on a Cessna 402 with an airline called Cape Air. It was going from Boston to Saranac Lake. And you get to sit up front, you get the view out the front of the windscreen, you see the pilot, you see, everything inside. So when you fly commercial, when you're, just kind of going on your own, you got your window maybe and, magazine, you don't really know what's going on. This flight, you see it all. They use runway 27, the shorter runway at Logan for these flights. So you're immediately pointed directly at the waterfront when you take off. You lift off, you see the waterfront, you see the financial district, you make a right turn up the Charles River, see just, the entire city of Boston, Cambridge on the right. And it was like, oh my God, this is real. It's something that you don't experience when you're flying commercial. So it was like an immediate, most pilots have this moment where it just clicks and you're obsessed. So soon after that, I did my first intro flight at Gaithersburg, Maryland, near Washington, D.C. And did the intro, it was about half hour up, half hour down, signed up for lessons, immediately, every weekend after that. So the whole week at work, all I can do is think about that flight and, just thinking about that view out the windscreen and the happy little instrument staring back at you. So
yeah, that's awesome. The bug kind of bit you in that moment.
Immediately.
And yeah, you had that visual, which I guess I never thought about previously, of not being able to see what's going on up in the cockpit. But when you do get the visual for your first time, kind of puts a different perspective, a different spin on it for sure.
Yeah. And that's a big theme for me in both aviation and teaching is that when things become real, they click and, you can fly, hundreds of flights commercially and, not really know what's going on. And that's probably a good thing for most people. But, when it clicks, it clicks.
Yeah. And you've taken that perspective and almost transformed it now into your teaching as well, like you said. So that's awesome. Do you remember the first student that you ever taught and what you learned from that specific student in that experience?
So my teaching philosophy was forged right away when I started teaching. When you become a flight instructor, you do your ratings. Most people do the order that it usually happens is you do your private pilot, you go to instrument, you do commercial, you do a CFI, and then you start instructing. All of those ratings get progressively harder, of course. Right. And the focus the whole time is you're trying to fly as close to perfectly as you can. Mm-hmm. You're trying to fly, within the ACS standards, but you're also trying to fly as perfectly and as ahead of the aircraft as you possibly can. That's your focus. That changes when you instruct. And it changed the first time I instructed a student. This was, I brand new, ink wasn't dry on my CFI ticket. One of the school's students, another instructor's students, was post-solo, meaning he had done his solo and just kind of wanted to go up in the pattern a little bit. So he wasn't my student. And there was nothing wrong with how he flew, but it was obviously different. And it was not, he was a private pilot student. It wasn't as good as what you would expect from a CFI. And so being able to be comfortable with imperfection, where when you're flying and when you're training, you're trying to stamp down on imperfection as much as you can. You can't do that as a flight instructor. You have to let your students make mistakes in a way that's still safe. You're not going to do anybody any benefit if you're immediately jumping on the control and saying, okay, my control isn't fixing it.
Right. Learning from experience, 100%.
Right.
Yeah. That's awesome. No fear involved. I feel like it's usually it's usually extremely daunting.
It's incredible fear. I mean, I'm a control freak, which is not the best trait in flight instructors.
It can save lives sometimes.
It does, but you have to have a chill to you. You have to be able to kind of watch, some real shenanigans. I've developed this obviously over time, but you have to, be able to let your students get into some shenanigans and keep it safe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's amazing to hear how you first started. So how did you go from teaching and then moving more deeply into education? Was there a moment that this wasn't just flying and you wanted to be on the teaching side outside of being a CFI?
So teaching it's a new tier of mastery when you're flying. When you fly, like I always think about if I do a crosswind landing and it's, gusting 25 at my home airport and I come in and I make, I'd like to think a great landing, maybe it's a halfway decent landing. But the point is if you ask me how I did it, I might not know. It's kind of just like, well, yeah, you put the aileron into the wind, you go rudder opposite, et cetera. You do this with the flaps and speed. But you don't know at like an atomic level how it happens. When you instruct, you see what your students are doing and you know exactly why what they did worked out. And not only that, but the things that they could have done to make it not work out. So you can kind of see all the paths and you can see all of the, different ways. And, you get to the point where you can see before it even happens, what's going to happen. So it's just a different tier of mastery. I think it's just the next step of your own sort of journey.
Were there any gaps when you were going through your initial CFI and starting to teach students? Were there any gaps in traditional aviation training that you noticed that kind of rung a bell in your head of maybe I should step in here and maybe I can add some additional information or some training here that could help this out?
Online training has really changed the game for the better and for the worse. In the past, you would do your ratings with your instructor and you're most of the time the same school and oftentimes the exact same instructor would be doing your ground instruction. So everything was integrated. The instructor knew what you were doing in the air, obviously, and then was able to tie that in with what you were doing on the ground. Now, even before social media, but especially with social media, as a flight instructor, you'll be taking a student and you don't really know what kind of extracurricular training they're doing,
what they know or what they don't know.
And of course, I, as a purveyor of flight instruction online, I'm guilty as charged on this, both in terms of the online ground schools we do and then also just the social media. One of the most frustrating things as a flight instructor and for a student, I think, is when you get a student who has learned something from somewhere, reputable or not reputable, that's either different, in conflict with, or flat out incorrect vis-a-vis what you're training. So you kind of have to, play defense around that. And that's just something there wasn't a problem or a gap that existed before this plethora of online education training became available. So what we do at Flight Insight is we take the mandate out of our instruction. We'll never say, okay, for example, when you're flying an instrument approach, you say, okay, you're coming in a Cessna 172, let's say you're coming in at 2,300 RPM, you're in cruise, you get to the final approach fix, the needle gets to the top of the donut, you bring the power back to 1,700 RPM, you configure for flaps, set 80 knots. Even though that's exactly how I'll fly an instrument approach, we focus on the principle so that what I never want to picture is I never want to picture another flight instructor asking their student, well, why do you do it this way? I was like, well, Dan George taught me to do it that way. Right. So there's always a why and there's always a student journey behind it.
Right.
So that's what we're trying to fix.
Unteach bad habits sometimes.
Exactly.
Right. Because if you have someone coming in and they've been taught something in a completely different manner than you're used to teaching, you have to adjust and counteract that almost. So,
yeah.
And that can be difficult.
It can be counterproductive. So that's it's a benefit, obviously, that, that there is all this convenient training, but you need to be able to bring coherency and clarity back to it and integration.
Take us back to the early days of Flight Insight. Was there a moment when you really thought, I need to build this? This is a need out there in the world and I need to do it.
When you're teaching at a 141 school like I was, you obviously have to do ground school. You have to do in-person classroom ground school and teaching. So that was my first experience teaching ground school. And they provide you your own materials. They provide you your own visuals, presentation materials. Yeah, obviously, you put your own personal spin on it. And then the more you do it, the more kind of personalized it becomes. When I started teaching at the University of Maryland, doing a ground ground school there. Then I'm doing the entire thing on my own. I'm bringing my own presentation materials. I'm constructing the visuals, the animations, and I started to develop a knack for it. Started to develop ways of kind of visualizing procedures or visualizing concepts that I personally hadn't seen before. And so, I realized I enjoyed it. I realized it was something I kind of wanted to pursue a little bit more. So I started my own, private in the sense that it was, my own thing, ground schools, where, I went out and I recruited my own students. I, rented a space at a local airport, said, okay, we're going to do, it's called Flight Insight. It's this thing called Flight Insight that, we're just going to do a ground school. Obviously that led to, building everything from the ground up. So that was all of the visuals, all of the space. And it became something that stood alone where, even though we're doing something in a brick and mortar in-person environment, the materials can stand alone. So from there, it was just a really sort of natural step to platform that online, to be able to bring it to people that wanted to do an online environment, to, prefer that to an in-person.
Might as well expand the audience. If you already had all of, the building blocks there, might as well expand it and say, we can share this to a larger platform.
Yeah.
So that's great.
And the technology and the services are there to basically an off-the-shelf solution for an LMS, a learning management system, to allow students to be able to take advantage of your ground school. So we did that from there, and we moved it to now we have over 10,000 students across the world doing flight instruction with us, and then in addition to the 250,000 that are online seeing our stuff come out.
Yeah. Well, congrats. That's a huge accomplishment for an online ground school. I mean, that's started just as you falling in love with aviation, becoming a CFI to now where it is. I mean, I'm sure you look back and reflect and are like, what did I get myself into?
There's no way. Yeah. And I mean, the greatest thing is people saying like, I looked at this concept 5 or 6 times and it really clicked when I saw it your way. I mean, that's everything to be able to hear
extremely rewarding. And sometimes it just takes seeing it in a different light, someone explaining it to you a little differently, even if it's just a few tweaks, really can click for someone. So that's awesome. Yeah.
And it's people always say, oh, you have such a knack for explaining this. It's not a knack. I mean, you have to think about things obsessively. You have to think about things many different ways, and teaching it's cliche. Teaching is how you get mastery in a subject, especially when you're teaching students who require different styles of explaining, because it makes you think about things differently, and it makes you kind of trim and cut away, what you understand about a subject. And so now I can feel like I can explain things, 3, 4, 5 different ways, to where it feels so natural. And it's like, oh yeah, obviously that's how you explain this, but it's, it's a process.
So you've logged over 4,000 hours, most of it instructing. What keeps flight instruction meaningful and fresh for you after all of those hours in the right seat?
So yeah, a lot of those hours, what a lot of people don't see behind the 4,000 hours, when you're instructing, is what goes into moving people towards a goal. Mm-hmm. So the reality is a lot of those 4,000 hours are, okay, taxi back to runway 36.
Right.
Or, let's circle around the practice area, or, we'll do 7 nautical mile holds, just churning time. But, when you're moving students into ratings through check rides, that's a huge administrative process. It's a huge coaching process. It's a mentorship. It's an exercise in organization. It's an exercise in diplomacy, because you have to work with DPEs. So that level of professionalism really challenges you. Obviously, there's the aspect of being able to learn from your students, and when you're thinking of a new way of explaining something just because of the need to get through to a student, then you feel you understand it a little bit better. So you get kind of like a little charge almost, where when you get something, you gotta like take a walk to cool off kind of thing. Yeah. So that doesn't go away after 4,000 hours. Sometimes the taxi back to runway 36 gets old.
Always, yeah. I think that most CFIs would probably say the same thing for sure. I totally hear you. And, even though a lot of that was just doing pattern work, you're still having to be on the ball the entire time, eyes peeled, making sure that you are being attentive, because that's your responsibility. So that's a lot.
Yeah. And that's something that I don't think, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't kind of get across to a lot of people when you're flight training, is when you're in that right seat instructing, you're not actively on the controls, you're not flying, but you're flying in your mind. You're always several steps ahead, especially, if you're trying to coordinate with air traffic control. It's pretty taxing.
You're a Gold Seal CFI, so that means a lot in the industry, obviously. But what does that mean to you specifically?
Sure. The Gold Seal is something the FAA does as a recognition for instructors who are active enough to have, and I'm going to get the numbers wrong, which is not very Gold Seal-y of me. I believe it's within your last 10 recommendations for a check ride, at least 8 have passed. And if I'm wrong, you can put the lower third down here to correct. But what it essentially does is it shows that you're an instructor who is also actively moving students through to completion of their certificates. So what that means is that you've developed a mastery at each level of a student's journey that, starts from the moment that they come into the FBO and they say, okay, get me my student pilot certificate, let's do the intro flight, through, that really all important, getting them to their first solo, through, okay, let's get ready for the check ride, and let's get, let's start introducing the airman certification standards to you so that you're developing mastery there. So it's just a way to recognize that, these instructors are able to kind of see every phase of the process.
When you're working with students who might struggle to learn something differently, how do you adapt your approach? Do you have any specific examples in a use case scenario like that?
You're constantly adapting your approach when you're training. I mean, everybody learns differently. And obviously this is tough for instructors because you've got a spiel, right? You're doing things the way you have sort of found success with them, but very quickly you'll see that a lot of students aren't going to necessarily resonate with the way you're teaching at first. So you have to change things up and, get creative. With one of my students was having trouble with traffic calls in the pattern at a non-towered airport. So, we would actually go out onto the ramp. We would stand there. I would be, to his right as the instructor. He'd be on my left, and we would just kind of walk.
Oh, that's funny.
the ramp, and he would do the call outs.
That's awesome.
Another student was having trouble with communicating with the tower. So I would lock myself in the briefing room. He would be out in the middle of the FBO, and we would just talk to each other. I would play the role of the controller. He'd play the role of the pilot. So it gets downright weird sometimes.
Yeah, but that's great. I mean, you got to change it up if something's not clicking. I love the, hands-on approach to that, because sometimes, I'm sure students have been so frustrated with themselves and they get discouraged. I mean, everybody's been there at one point or another, and whether it's training in flight school or in anything else in life, you get to the point where you're like, I just am not getting this. What else can I possibly do? And all it takes is sometimes someone giving you a different perspective. So that's awesome. I wish someone would have done that for me.
Yeah. And as instructors, we forget that frustration, I think. And we've all gone through that. I mean, I certainly did when I was training there, especially, landing is what gives everybody a hard time. And I remember those times when I was trying to, pre-solo, when I was trying to get really good at landings, that I would have a terrible day and I would go home and it's like, I couldn't even remember my own name. Like, that's how jumbled up I was. And we forget that. And it works both ways. It's like, okay, you can yourself think of a different way of explaining something so that it clicks, or, step out of your own way and say, one should fly with, somebody else. Just once and see if that clicks. And I remember, one of my students went to fly with another instructor and they explained it a different way. And, this person like almost broke down in tears, was like, I can't believe I didn't get it until I flew with,
Yeah.
I just had to get Dan out of the cockpit.
Yeah. That's funny. So you talk a lot about showing and not telling. Can you walk us through a specific moment where that flipped a switch for a student? Do you have any specific memories where that really just hit it off for them?
Yeah. So one thing I love to do, as context, my background before I became a pilot, I was, huge into flight simulator, Microsoft Flight Simulator, just jump in, like, even from when I was a kid, you land the 737 on the aircraft carrier, that kind of stuff. That's a great tool. And I felt like I was ahead a little bit in terms of my knowledge because of having done that. But what I was guilty of, and what I've seen other people that are, familiar with simulators do when they start to fly for real, is they overfixate on the instruments. One of them especially is the vertical speed indicator, which tells you how fast you're going up or how quickly you're going down. In the simulator, that is very much a real-time instrument, and it can be used as a gauge for like what your aircraft pitch attitude is doing. So what I'll see a lot of students doing is they'll stare at that to try to set their pitch attitude. unfortunately, because of the way the VSI works, it's not a real-time instrument. It lags. It's a lagging indicator. So I can explain that, right? And that can, that's the telling part, right? And say, okay, you need to be looking outside. You need to be looking at the horizon for reference, or I can show it. And what I love to do is say, okay, we'll get up into cruise in a, safe area in the practice area. Say, okay, my controls, I want you to look at the vertical speed indicator. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to abruptly pitch the aircraft up. What do you think the vertical speed indicator is going to do? And they say it's going to show a climb. Okay, let's do it. So, pull back pretty hard on the stick. And what happens? The vertical speed indicator takes a dip at first, just because of the momentum of what the aircraft is doing. And then very slowly catch up to what the aircraft is doing. And say, okay, this is a lagging indicator. This is a lagging indication of what the aircraft attitude is. The real time is looking out at the horizon. That's your best instrument. It's the reason so many of these instruments are not required for VFR flight. In fact, the VSI isn't required for IFR flight even, because you have such better real substitutes for it. Now, when you don't have that in instrument flight, obviously you need to come inside, but that your stick and rudder skills are going to get so much better when you realize things like that. So that's show, don't tell.
So what does advanced whiteboarding look like in practice? That's a strategy you use quite a bit. Could you describe a lesson, maybe IFR altitudes or another tricky topic where this visual style made a huge difference in teaching?
So when we teach, we use whiteboards a lot in ground school, where we'll be up diagramming a procedure or, just showing notes or something like that. Advanced whiteboarding is the idea behind that is you're taking a concept or you're taking a visual and you're presenting it in a number of ways using an animation. So for something like a minimum IFR altitude, for example, where that's presented graphically is on a low en route chart, IFR low en route chart. You'll see an airway, the Victor airway or something. It'll have a number of altitudes on top of it. The MEA, minimum en route altitude, the minimum obstruction clearance altitude, elsewhere, there'll be the Iroka. There's plenty of these minimum altitudes. What we do is we'll show that, and then we'll break that into a lateral view where we'll show it now not from the top down, but from the lateral, and we'll change it as that altitude is changing along the route of a flight. So it'll show, this high for an MEA, and then you cross a certain intersection, it'll go down. And then we'll also bring in terrain to show you what the required obstacle clearance is. We'll bring in nav aids on either side of that to show you what kind of nav aid coverage you're getting within, 22 miles or whatever. So you're seeing things from a number of perspectives. You're seeing it not only in an organic way, the way it'll actually be in real life, but you're also seeing it the way the FAA kind of presents it on the chart, so that there's this, direct connection, and you can really trace where these numbers in the chart are applying in real life.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's something you use frequently, obviously, in your teaching.
Yeah, very much so. That's what we're trying to do. We sort of, blow up the publication, whether it's an IFR route or, our bread and butter is, we're working with, the IFR approach plates and just kind of blowing out all the points on there.
So shifting gears a little bit away from your teaching strategies and more towards how you choose what kind of content to really focus on, is there a way that, or are you solving problems you see in the cockpit or anticipating questions students don't know how to ask? I mean, how do you predict what content is best to focus on? Certain
concepts lend themselves better to online visual training than others. Instrument training, I think, is our bread and butter because it's procedural, because it's presented visually. It's not something that's kinesthetic, as I say. It's not something that's like a look and a feel.
Yeah, not tangible.
It's not tangible it's not tangible in the sense that stick and rudder flying is tangible.
Right.
Sometimes I say that, I don't know if this resonates or not, but sometimes I say when you go from private to IFR, private is like you're learning a sport, right? You're learning, almost like hand-eye coordination, and you have to feel it. When you go to IFR, it's almost like getting on the job training, right? It's like, okay, here's how the cash register works, or here's how the computer works. That's probably not fair, and it's a generalization, but that's the mind shift. So bringing in the visuals really works for that, just because it is so much ground training. It is so much lends itself to not happening within the cockpit. Things like, how do you land in a crosswind? Yes, we do have courses on that. We have a whole course on how to land. We do videos on, the theory behind energy management, the law of the roller coaster, as Wolfgang Langewiesche calls it in Stick and Rudder. If you haven't read that, that's, drop everything and go read it, because it changed my perspective on how to fly. But things like that obviously do better in the cockpit.
Yeah, of course. And so many students do struggle with instrument because it is more textbook focused. So obviously that's a nice additional resource to have for something like that. What's changed most in aviation education specifically since you started? And do you think there's anything that still hasn't caught up?
So there's a huge change that's happened since I started flying. When I started flying, the FAA was still using what's called the practical test standards, the PTS. And part of what that meant, or not necessarily part of the PTS, but part of the way things worked was on the knowledge test. People call it the written test, which is also kind of like an archaic, right? It's the multiple choice test that you need to take. They used to release all the answers and the questions. So you could conceivably, and a lot of people did this, sit there and memorize all of the question bank, and then you were sure to see a subset of that on the test. Now, obviously, that wouldn't have helped you for the oral portion of the check ride, but there's still there was still a tick the box mentality towards that as well, where it's like, okay, let me just learn a tomato flames, or let me learn, the VFR weather minima.
Right. The memorization
and stuff like that. And that's gone away. The need for that has gone away, because we've moved on to scenario based. We've moved on to airman certification standards, and DPEs are now saying, okay, don't just, ratchet off what the required equipment is. I'm going to ask you a real world scenario. And so first of all, it's a great transition that we've done because it makes for smarter pilots. And secondly, it means that pilots and students crave a different level of mastery. And this check the box mentality isn't going to make it work anymore. So that's what we have done when we came along with Flight Insight. And all of our lessons, or a lot of our lessons, are designed around, this is a real flight that we're going to simulate, or we're going to have sort of like a chair flying session for, and it's going to bring up a lot of questions that not only will you see on your check ride, but you're also going to see as a professional pilot. So for people who are general aviation pilots, that are just looking for that higher level of mastery, it serves that purpose. And then it's also serving the purpose for the career focused folks out there who are looking to, really shine in their interviews, where, they'll come out and say, okay, yeah, your stuff, but wow, you really are able to apply it in a real world scenario, so that, when you're doing your first airline interview or your first company interview, you really make a great impression.
Of course. It helps students answer the why to the how and what.
Exactly.
And it gives them that extra leg up. And I think that is a transferable skill, obviously, in any area, but that's great that you guys apply that. So how has technology improved flight training? Has there been any struggles using tech in this space? I mean, we're in a digital world now. Obviously, FlightInsight's a big part of that as well. But from your perspective, how has tech changed the game?
Yeah, so it's a cliche, but it's true. Technology is only as good as the person that uses it. We hear that up left, right, and center. It's true. I probably still am, but I was pretty old school when it came to my approach to technology. Obviously, when I did my training, I used FlightInsight, and I'm not just saying that because I'm between two wings right now. But when I was teaching, I was a little, especially teaching from ab initio, from people who were just starting out. I was a little cautious about bringing in technology like that at first. Because I wanted to make sure that the fundamentals were getting there. And because I had seen so many people obsess over the technology before they started getting comfortable with the aircraft. So, people would be like, for example, staring at their ADS-B and feeds, and, instead of looking out the window, just things like that. And, it caused more anxiety than it needed to, and it caused kind of like a fixation thing. So I've gotten a lot more calm about that, I think, in my instructing, where, you need to kind of work with the student and where they're coming from. If they're a total, tech head and they really are getting into the equipment, and say, okay, that's wonderful. Let's work with it that way. Just make sure that you're also, incorporating a good scan and things like that. I'm not as old school as some people, or as some of my old students remember me as.
Yeah. Well, you got to change with the times. Exactly, but also, I do think that people can use tech as a crutch sometimes, and that's obviously not great for safety, but using it as a tool to your advantage to double check yourself, which is a huge part of aviation in general, is checklists, double checking, triple checking. That's a huge part of it. So obviously using advanced technology in situations like that is obviously a huge help.
Yeah. And that's the other side of it, right? There's this negative side, which is what I talked about, which is this fixation thing. But there's also this, don't make sure you're also availing yourself of technology. There's people on the other end of the spectrum. Like I had a student that, full respect here, had, I forget what they had in the aircraft, but I know they had a working ADF. So they were able to do NDB approaches, which is like, we need to do this immediately because I've never actually done one in real life. But there's no GPS in the aircraft. So like literally everything, like we'd be doing instrument training and ATC would be vectoring you to a GPS fix. And they'd be like, no, unable, I'm SLAN alpha. I'm only able to do, ILS or VOR stuff. And it's like, you should really get comfortable with this because it's going to save your bacon one day. Beyond just in the cockpit though, technology is great for training, especially IFR, because you're able to, a great use case is simulators, because you're able to iterate an approach multiple times. I mean, you can do it in a like a Redbird thing, like a full motion, like an AATD or a BATD. You can do it at home in your PC flight simulator, where you're able to sit there and do multiple approaches, one right after the other, rather than, burn up 2.5 hours of Hobbs time. You can integrate FlightInsight into Flight Simulator very easily, so that you're able to overlay your, GPS, your Flight Simulator derived position within FlightInsight as if you're in the actual aircraft, so that you're getting familiar with every single thing that you'd be doing in the actual cockpit using FlightInsight. So yes, don't use it as a crutch, but also don't ignore it because it makes your life easier. And
then obviously allowing you to stream education out to the masses is obviously a huge plus there too.
Yeah, I missed the whole, mail order DVD,
VHS life.
VHS life. Yeah, that's, the hats off to King Schools and then that started that way. But that there's a lot more hustle involved in that. Whereas
obviously,
now we're platformed on our LMS and it's plug and play. It's great.
We're spoiled.
We're very spoiled.
So what advice would you give to CFIs or any other training organization for that matter that is trying to form a deeper connection with a student? If they're struggling, what's one piece of advice you would probably give them that you've been there and you're like, you know what, try it this way?
So the biggest piece of advice I can give, and this is hard, very tough to do, but I think it's very important, is learn to get comfortable with other instructors' styles. So when I'm instructing, I'm very particular, and I think most instructors are very particular about how they want things done. They want to see, say, as an example, when I'm first teaching a student, the 4 fundamentals of flight, we'll go up into the practice area. Okay, so this is how you level off from a climb, right? We're in the climb. First, you'll pitch down to the horizon, level off. Let the aircraft accelerate to cruise, bring the power back to, your cruise RPM or your cruise manifold setting, trim the aircraft out, and then run your cruise checklist. That's how I like to teach. I happen to think it's the best way. However, other students will come in and they'll do what's called leveling off with power, where you're in the climb and then you're just pulling power back and you're kind of doing things in reverse. I get really antsy when I see that. Is it unsafe? No. Is it, are you busting the ACS tolerances? Would you fail a check ride doing that? I don't think so. If it's my student, I will immediately say something. If it's somebody else's student, this is where it gets hard. You have to bite your tongue.
Mm-hmm. Pick your battles.
Well, so it's not even pick your battles. It's somebody has taught them this way. Mm-hmm. They didn't, as they say, they didn't lick this off the rocks. They got it from somewhere. So it's very frustrating for a student to have worked with an instructor and to have learned their style and then fly with somebody else, put that into practice, having learned that, and then being told, no, that's wrong. I mean, that's a real ego hit. Not even an ego hit. I mean, that's a real like, oh my God, I failed. So you need to be tolerant of the, many, many different ways of teaching flying. It has to be safe, obviously. It has to be within ACS tolerances. We don't want to send people to fail check rides. And, if your chief pilot is teaching them to do it a different way than you are, you have to, it's like any job, you have to do what your boss tells you. Or, if, your school has an SOP, you've got to teach within the SOP and all that. But, failing all that or outside of all that, be tolerant of other styles that you've seen in the cockpit. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying before about this idea of be okay with imperfection or what you think is imperfection.
Right. And adjusting when needed. Yeah. And being able to deviate and look at something from a different point of view, because that helps.
And if you are going to, sort of insert your own training in there, make sure you're justifying it. Make sure you're saying, this is why I'm teaching you a little bit differently.
Right. Because they want to know.
They need to know, yeah, especially if they've learned it one way. It's like, okay, so if I'm flying with another instructor student once, I probably won't say a thing. But if they're now coming on to be my student and I'm going to be, putting them onto a check ride, it's like, okay, we're gonna kind of mold you a little bit differently. I don't want you going off to a check ride leveling off with power. Sorry.
So you've created a model that scales beyond just your own students. What could other flight schools or organizations borrow from your approach to grow their own impact?
So because we've scaled and because we now have over 10,000 pilots who have listened to my voice and have heard the way I like to conceptualize things, there's a bit of standardization that's happened. And I think a challenge for flight schools is standardization of training, right? So you'll have CFIs doing their own take of instruction. And, my CFI had a great kind of way that he talked about this, was that like you have kind of like your CFI grandfather. I don't know if like that analogy has gotten out to other people. But what it means basically is that like, okay, I had my instructor and then I go on and I teach my students. That student is the grandchild, the CFI grandchild of my instructor. So what you're doing is you're creating a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And if there's no standardization, it can get kind of confusing. And, this gets into, the frustration that some students feel with how instructors are different when they switch between them. So one benefit of our training is the ability to integrate that, the ability to bring the CFI into what we're teaching. So we have a tool within FlightInsight that allows students to opt their instructors, to invite their instructors to see their progress as they go through the course. So it's not just like, okay, we're going to show up and we're going to, do procedure turns today. It's, okay, you did the lesson with FlightInsight on procedure turns. This is what we're going to do in the cockpit today, and this is going to be the integration. So that is one way of integration. Another way is tying in what we're doing. We're working on this now, tying in what we're doing with a recommended flight syllabus. So that you're actually, giving a game plan to CFIs and saying, okay, this student isn't just doing Dan's coursework and it's sort of living in a vacuum. There's a coherent connection between what they're learning and what you can do. And, here's lesson 8, procedure turns. This is what you'll do out there if you want.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's a great recommendation. You've built tools for CFIs to follow student progress and stay engaged. What's the big picture behind these new innovations that you've worked on?
The big picture is integration again. It's the ability for CFIs to not feel like their students are learning in a bubble, learning in a vacuum, to bring them into the process. Flight instructors is the most important sort of person in the flight training universe. It's not FlightInsight. It's not, not even the FAA. It's the flight instructor themselves. So having them in the driver's seat and them as the fulcrum of everything that goes on is so important. And it's the single biggest thing that flight schools and flight instructors have demanded of me, is a way to buy into the process. It's like, hey, it's great. I want to recommend FlightInsight ground schools to my students, but what does that do for me? What's in it for me? Right. And what's in it for you as the flight instructor is this ability to be hand in glove within the process. So our portal tool allows the student to sign up and then invite their instructor in, or conversely, the instructor can invite their student to come along. And as long as the student is a FlightInsight's student, they're able to show lesson by lesson where they're at. It'll match up within the syllabus. So there's this great integration that's going on.
So tell us about your new weekly quiz app. Aviation's almost version of Wordle in a way. So what kind of learning behavior are you hoping that this builds? Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's Wordle for aviation.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, so one thing we've always done is we do these weekly quizzes, which are pretty quick. They don't take long. Don't think of it as like an FAA practice quiz. It's really about 5, 6, 7 questions that are coming in on a certain topic. And recently we integrated that within our app so that it's more gamified, meaning you can take these and you can work your way through a leaderboard. You can challenge yourself. You can, sort of compare yourself to everybody else in the FBO. We're going to have sort of specialized missions that we call them, where, we're going to take a flight from one airport to another, and there'll be a series of these quizzes over the course of a few weeks or a month. So, there's this journey that you can kind of come along with us, and it's just a fun thing as a way to kind of engage pilots a little bit more.
Yeah, and gamify it. We're always looking for a new fun way to learn. So that's awesome. Shifting gears again, more into looking towards the future. What's the long-term vision for Flight Insight? Where do you hope to take this next? I mean, how do you see your role shaping aviation education in years to come? We've talked about the beginning of Flight Insight, but what's next? So
there's a number of ways we want to go. We want to go, as I've talked about a lot here already, we want to go more hand in glove with flight schools. We don't want to be just another provider providing education in a vacuum. We want to work with flight schools. We want to make sure that what we're doing is relevant with both 61 and 141 schools, and that there's like a real coherence behind training to empower the schools and to empower their students. We want to bring in new technology. We've talked about Wordle for Aviation, which is a lot of fun and everything, and it's going to, hopefully be, something that helps people pass the time when it's raining in the FBO or whatever. But we also want to integrate more interactivity with our lessons so that it's not as passive as it can seem when you're just consuming a video lecture or something like that. So we're looking into interactivity in terms of one sort of great route to go down is air traffic control practice. So we have a VFR radio communication course where we partnered with Pilot Edge, which provides real-time simulated, well, not simulated, it's real people, but simulated air traffic control in a flight simulator environment, just to kind of demonstrate the different ways that you can communicate in airspace. We want to go a step further than that. And we actually want to empower our students to be able to speak. So it's almost like, think like Duolingo for air traffic control.
Yeah, engaging them more. And letting them practice it is definitely helpful.
Because one of the things that was most, I guess, surprising for me when I got into aviation and instruction was one of the biggest challenges students have, besides landing, which is probably number one. But the things that you would normally think are the challenging things pale in comparison to communicating on the radio. Mm-hmm. You and I are talking, we've all been talking our whole lives. And if we grew up in this country, we've been talking English our whole life. That goes out the window when you're in the cockpit. Not only because it's jargony and it's a new language, but your IQ drops 30 points in the cockpit. You become tongue-tied. I mean, I'd said before when I was training, there was times I couldn't even tell you what my own name was.
Right.
It's just what happens when you're up there. Now, you have to be empathetic also even more when you think about non-English speakers who make up a large proportion of who are doing training. And we want to make sure that they're comfortable and that they've got the practice that they need to get over the hump of being able to talk to air traffic control so they can focus on the actual stick and rudder and the actual procedural things of their job. Right. So that's going to help them, but it's also going to help all of us in aviation have more pilots out there who are more confident on the radios, because for the time being, we are still really dependent on talking our way through situations like this.
Right. And confidence is always key in stick and rudder flying, but also in your conversation, because you don't want to have to be worrying about that when you're also trying to look out the window, look for traffic, worry about everything else that's going on. You really want to have that engaging experience for your students. So that's awesome. What's one piece of advice that you would give to someone just starting out in aviation education?
I would say be humble about how you're teaching. When you're learning, you're sipping information through a fire hose. A lot of it is memorization. A lot of it is rote. And you will tend to regurgitate that back to your students. As you get, and this happens naturally, it's not even a piece of advice you need to internalize, but just be aware of. As you teach more and more, you start to question that a little bit and say, a great example is when you're transitioning to a constant speed propeller aircraft, which has a controllable pitch propeller, you learn something called, a lot of pilots call 25 squared. Okay. And it's because pilots are bad at math. We call it 25 squared, which means basically you have a manifold pressure, which is what the throttle controls, which is it's measuring the amount of power the engine is producing, and that'll be at 25 inches. This is like something for like a climb, for example, be something at 25 inches, and then you'll have the propeller at 2,500 RPM. And there's a wives' tale out there that says you can never go past square. You can never over square your setting, meaning that you don't want to have the prop be working too much. And so people think of that 25 as almost like, the speed of light, like it just cannot be crossed. Ask why, okay? Because why is that? So think a little harder. 25 inches, what's the unit of measurement? Inches, which is a US imperial version, or a US imperial measurement of length, right? It's yay long, and it's inches of mercury. So it's measuring how much mercury is being displaced by the pressure within the manifold. So that's one unit of measurement. The other unit measurement is RPM. Completely different. It's a complete coincidence that the 25 inches of manifold pressure are close to or congruent with the 2,500 RPM on your tachometer. If we were in Europe or any country that doesn't use imperial units, they're not talking inches of mercury. They're talking millibars. And I don't know what millibars are in 25 inches, but it's nowhere close to 25. So this idea of 25 squared is it's a coincidence that they're close, and it's completely meaningless. So this idea that you can't over square your settings, go look at your POH, go look at your cruise settings, and think about a turbo aircraft, which is going to have much higher manifold pressure settings. And in the POH for a turbo, it's going to say something like 37 inches to 2,500. So question it. This is a long-winded way of saying question the stuff that you've picked up in your training before you go pass it on and before you go make your CFI grandchild, these copies of copies.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Always backing up your knowledge, trying to figure out your why before you go spread information as well, and being inquisitive is always extremely important.
And you'll make a mistake. I mean, God knows I've said some
always,
things
yeah.
that
I mean,
later
everybody...
on I'm just like, wait a second. And that goes for, I've been really, blessed to have really great instructors. And there will be some things that I can think of down the road, and I was just like, that wasn't right.
Does your CFI know what you do now? Have you been in contact at all?
We keep up. Yeah. I mean, I've had a number of CFIs, and we're all friends. And
that's awesome.
Because when I became a CFI, we worked at the same school together. So yeah, there's group chats. There's happy hours.
So are there any trends or red flags in aviation instruction right now that you think deserve a little bit more attention?
I think we're going through a cycle now in the industry where CFIs are, by necessity, finding themselves instructing longer than they may have planned to. You're seeing, even at these, big 141 or big flow through programs, you're seeing CFIs who are there for 2 years or something like that. A lot of people are saying, I haven't been in this business that long. I mean, it's really been about a decade, but, a lot of the old timers are saying this is sort of like a return to normalcy in the industry. A lot of other people that are a little bit, newer might be saying, oh my God, it's the end of the world. I feel like people that have been here for, previous ends of the world are a little bit more cool about it. But the thing to watch out for, though, is that burnout is potentially becoming a real thing, where you're at a 141 program, or even if you're at any flight school as an instructor, you're really feeling the pinch, and you're feeling this almost bureaucracy crushing down on you, where you're having to have this sort of check the box mentality because of the school or because of the FAA or because of whatever. There's a need to bring back coherence, and there's a need to bring back clarity in instruction, so that we're not just saying, okay, I've got to get this student through lesson 8. I've got to get them to understand, the difference between a parallel and a teardrop entry. It's like, okay, how is that going to help you in your career as an instructor? And then later on, whatever you want to do, if it's go to the airlines, and how's that going to help your student? Right. So keep that on the focus. And that's a way to kind of help with the burnout.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a big trend, because I think that CFIs are now experiencing a different wave. And if they're younger, they didn't know what it looked like before this big push. So it's kind of a mindset adjustment for them, and knowing that, you kind of got to be where your feet are at the moment and take it in and enjoy it if you can. I know it's long days, and being a CFI is an extremely difficult job, but it's a very important one. So.
And take it from somebody who's been a full-time CFI for longer than, most of you guys have planned to be. You will get better because of it. So see it as the opportunity to bring a higher level of mastery. Yes, you're not in a 7.3. You're not in a 121 program. You're not building multi-time the way you want to be building multi-time necessarily. But when you progress in your airline career, and again, I'm assuming you're 121 folks, but even if you're, going to go the 135 route or whatever else, timeshare 91, as you progress in your career, you will move up to check airman level. You will move up to a place where you will need to be teaching at some point. So this time that you're spending now on getting really good at teaching is going to help you in your career, and it's going to be an advantage. Yeah,
that's great advice. Can you share a moment of failure or even doubt and what you learned from it? And maybe, someone could hear that and feel a little bit more secure knowing that someone else has had that same feeling.
So in Flight Insight, when we started, the first online course was Private Pilot Online Ground School. Naturally, that's what you're going to start with, because that's what people start with. And because I had done most of my ground schools in private, it was a place to jump off from. The initial release was just, okay, let's just create this course and then pop it out there into the ether, onto the internet. And it didn't get traction because, who's Dan George? Who's Flight Insight? Who's this now? And that's, that's the way any kind of business will get started. And so when we brought in other courses and other work, we tested everything out, and we still do this because Flight Insight has a YouTube channel where we're out twice a week with content that you're not going to see in courses, but it informs what we want to build into our more robust courses. So we're working directly with our potential students in what do they want to see, what clicks with them, what doesn't click with them. So, you're hearing from it from comments, you're hearing from emails, and then you're also hearing because it's YouTube and because it's the internet, you're watching the analytics. You can see what resonates just because of, what your engagement looks like. And that's a really important piece of feedback. And when you bring that into the course, now all of a sudden you've created a product that's relevant. So, this is something that, a lot of people in business will stress for. It's like, don't create the product before you have identified the need, right? Start with the need and then build the product into that. Right.
Cart before the horse, for sure.
Exactly.
After everything that you've built and all of the students that you've taught, both online and ground school, even in person in the cockpit, what still excites you the most about aviation?
Seeing how I was wrong and changing the way I teach. So,
really?
Yeah. And I'm wrong a lot, as people will point out. Some people point out I'm wrong and they're wrong. Some people will point out I'm wrong and I'm wrong. But one way or the other, I'm going to kind of go back and say, like, okay, what did I miss? What did I not think about here? And I'm always shocked because there are instructors out there, and there are pilots out there who just have this unbelievable font of knowledge, and seem to be able to just ratchet this stuff off. And I know it seems that way in my stuff, but you guys don't tell I'm rehearsing everything.
Yeah, it takes a lot of practice to teach other people.
If I have to go back at something I haven't looked at in 6 months, I'm going to forget it. It's just how it is. So when, I go back and I learn something a new way, that's really rewarding.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, for our listeners here on Between Two Wings who want to learn more or follow your work at Flight Insight, where should they go? Where should they start?
So we're all over social media. We're on YouTube. We're on TikTok. We're on Instagram. And all of that is just ways to get your feet wet in our sort of style of training. And then we have 8 ground school courses. We have private, we have IFR, commercial, CFI. We have some ancillary courses like our landing course. VFR radio communication. We have a transition to glass cockpit course. And once you're in our courses, you get them for life. So again, the focus is not just, get you through a check ride. It's, we want you coming back to our material. We keep them up to date. So, you buy them now in 2025 or whatever, and you come back 5 years later, not only will you still have access, but that material will have been updated so that it's not, if a reg changes or something like that.
Yeah, that's huge.
Or if a new piece of avionics comes out, we're going to have incorporated that into it. So, you start there, get in touch, get yourself on the email list. You'll get, our aviation quizzes every week. So we hope to see you all over the internet.
That's awesome. Final takeaway before we wrap up here. Why does aviation education still matter? And what's at stake if you, we, or anyone really got it wrong?
I don't want to think about what's at stake, but so much is. Education is so important in aviation. Lives are at stake, obviously. So it's extraordinarily humbling to think about the stakes of getting something correct or incorrect. And again, it's so easy for, something like I was just talking about, like this 25 squared example. I mean, people aren't going to die because of that. Maybe engines will over time. But it's so easy for a kernel of received knowledge like that to just kind of get passed on. So the stakes for questioning why we're teaching what we're doing are really high. And then to bring it back like a little bit less stark terms, it's also a real shame when you encounter a student who has had something missing in their training. And I was one of these students. It's not the fault of anybody. If anything, it's my own fault for not, doing my homework as a student. But there are things I learned about instrument flying from creating FlightInsight that I didn't know as an instrument student, that I didn't know as a CFII. And that to me is a little unacceptable. There is something, I can't think of an example. They're arcane. I knew a lot. It wasn't like I was completely ignorant of everything, but there are still some things that I probably should have known. And you'll come across students or pilots or longtime pilots who will have those gaps in their knowledge. That's what we're looking to change at FlightInsight. We want, and one of the best pieces of feedback that I've received is I had a private pilot student come say, I did my private pilot check ride, I passed, and one of the pieces of feedback I got from the DPE was they said that my level of knowledge was at the commercial level of what we often see. And, we don't have to do that, right? We can get people to pass, but we want you to enjoy learning with us to the point where you're coming in and you're the smartest pilot in the room. You're the smartest guy in the FBO because you've been exposed to things that we think that you're ready for. It's not like these are advanced, weight topics. We think we can teach them in a way that resonates with people who are starting out, who are earlier in their training. We think it's important to get that in front of people. Mm-hmm. And we think it's going to make you a better pilot. So that's, that was something I didn't have. And that's what I'm trying to address. Yeah.
That's a great takeaway, and always a lesson to have an open mind. You never know what you don't know. There's always something to learn, mm-hmm. whether you're the most advanced CFII out there, or you're just starting out in teaching and education in any capacity. There's always something to learn. So that's great. Well, Dan, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
That
was
awesome.
Really great. I appreciate it, Amelia.
I really hope that everybody listening, whether they're trying to be a CFI or not, they got something to, take home with. So that's really exciting for us.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity.